Charlotte's family had just moved into a big old house in a new town. Charlotte was excited to start over in a new place, but something felt off about the house. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It didn't take long for strange things to start happening. Doors would open and close on their own, footsteps could be heard when no one was around, and objects would move without explanation. Charlotte tried to brush it off, telling herself that it was just an old house settling. But as the days went by, the occurrences became more and more frequent and more unsettling. One day, Charlotte was exploring the attic when she stumbled upon an old journal. The journal belonged to a woman who had lived in the house over 100 years ago. The woman had been driven to madness by the spirits that haunted the house, and had eventually taken her own life. As Charlotte read through the journal, she felt a chill run down her spine. She had never believed in ghosts before, but the journal was proof that something sinister was at work in the house. That night, Charlotte was lying in bed when she heard a strange sound coming from outside her room. It sounded like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was just her imagination, but the noise only grew louder. Finally, she got up the courage to investigate. As she crept down the hallway, the sound grew louder and louder. It was coming from the room at the end of the hall. Charlotte hesitated for a moment before slowly pushing open the door. The room was empty except for an old trunk sitting in the corner. The trunk was open, and Charlotte could see that it was filled with old clothes and other items. But as she approached, the trunk slammed shut on its own. Charlotte screamed and tried to run out of the room, but the door wouldn't budge. She was trapped. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and she could see her breath in the air. A voice whispered in her ear,
"Get out while you still can."
With a burst of strength, Charlotte managed to push open the door and ran down the hallway, away from the room. She didn't stop running until she was outside, panting and gasping for breath. The next day, Charlotte did some research on the history of the house. She discovered that it had been built by a wealthy family in the late 1800s. The family had been known for their lavish parties and extravagant lifestyle, but rumors had circulated that they had been involved in some dark and sinister practices. The family had disappeared without a trace, leaving the house to fall into disrepair. Charlotte knew that she had to do something to rid the house of the spirits that were haunting it. She sought the help of a local psychic, who confirmed that the house was indeed haunted and that the spirits were dangerous. Together, they performed a cleansing ritual, but it only seemed to make the spirits angrier. One night, Charlotte woke up to find that her room was filled with a strange mist. She could hear whispers and voices all around her, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She screamed and bolted out of the room, running down the hallway and out of the house. The next morning, Charlotte's parents found her asleep on the front porch, shivering and pale. They decided that they couldn't stay in the house any longer and began to make arrangements to move out. As they were packing up their things, Charlotte came across an old portrait of the family who had built the house. As Charlotte looked at the portrait, she realized that she recognized one of the faces. It was the same face that she had seen in her nightmares, the face of the woman who had written the journal that she had found in the attic. Charlotte's heart raced as she realized that the woman was a member of the family who had built the house. She knew that the only way to put an end to the haunting was to uncover the truth about what had happened to the family. She spent hours at the local library, poring over old newspapers and historical documents. Eventually, she found what she was looking for. It turned out that the family had indeed been involved in some dark and sinister practices, including black magic and human sacrifice. When their practices were discovered, they had fled the town, leaving the house to be taken over by the spirits that they had summoned. Armed with this knowledge, Charlotte knew what she had to do. She returned to the house, determined to put an end to the haunting once and for all. She made her way to the attic, where she had found the journal, and began to perform a ritual of her own. She lit candles, burned sage, and recited incantations that she had learned from the psychic. As she performed the ritual, she could feel the energy in the room shifting. The air grew colder, and the mist that had plagued her room began to dissipate. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned around, expecting to see a ghostly apparition, but instead, she saw a woman in old-fashioned clothing standing behind her. The woman smiled at her, and Charlotte felt a wave of warmth wash over her. She knew that the woman was one of the members of the family who had built the house, and she felt a sense of closure as she looked into her eyes. The woman spoke to her, telling her that she had been trapped in the house for over 100 years, unable to rest until the truth had been uncovered. She thanked Charlotte for her help and told her that she could finally move on to the afterlife. With that, the woman disappeared, and Charlotte knew that the haunting was finally over. She went back downstairs to find her parents, who were packing up the last of their belongings. She told them what had happened and they looked at her in disbelief. But as they left the house for the last time, they all felt a sense of peace that they hadn't felt since they had moved in. They knew that the house would always be haunted by the ghosts of the past, but they also knew that they had helped to put them to rest. As they drove away from the house, Charlotte looked back at it one last time. She knew that she would never forget the experience, but she was also glad that it was over. She was ready to move on to a new chapter in her life, one that wasn't haunted by the ghosts of the past.